Hello and welcome to this very special CPD webinar with Dr Nicki Macklin, a researcher, advisor and speaker focused on the human side of organisational performance. My name is Kerri-anne Millard and I'm the Executive Director of Policy and Outreach at the Victorian Legal Services Board and Commissioner. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, the traditional owners of the lands on which we are broadcasting and recording this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and to emerging leaders in the community. I also pay respects to all First Nations peoples watching our presentation today. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr Nicki Macklin, who's come all the way from New Zealand, very long way, to share with us her fascinating and incredibly important work on kindness. Nicki has actually written a PhD on it, which I think is pretty cool. Nicki's doctoral thesis explored kindness in teams and organisations as a form of social capital and a lever for performance and quality improvement. Nicki is also an associate editor at British medical journal Leader, and she's a visiting scholar and guest lecturer at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, where she works with MBA students on organisational kindness and ethical leadership. Nicki's work has been published in the Harvard Business Review, featured in Forbes, and her research presented in peer-reviewed journals, including the BMJ Leader. Nicki holds several patient advocacy and advisory roles and works with a global network committed to putting kind care into practice across policy, leadership and system design. She's passionate about helping organisations create the conditions for people to do their best work, open-hearted cultures, clear expectations and shared accountability. Through her consulting practice, Kindframe, Nicki supports leaders, teams and governance groups to embed relational leadership and values-led culture. She also speaks regularly on kindness as a strategic asset in high-stakes professional environments, including healthcare, business and, of course, the law. So, why does kindness matter for early career lawyers and their supervisors, and why does the regulator of Victorian lawyers care? The VLSB+C exists to maintain and enhance public trust and confidence in Victorian lawyers and support the rule of law. And a huge part of that is supporting early career lawyers at that critical stage in their career, so they can go on to have healthy and sustainable careers as ethical, high-quality legal practitioners. We are an evidence-based regulator, and we know the first 5 years of practice can be challenging in a number of ways. The research also tells us that both young and early career lawyers, and that isn't always the same thing, experience higher rates of incivility in the workplace. Incivility is something that we know has ramifications for ethical climate, for wellbeing, and for retention rates within the profession. And that's why we want to talk about incivility and kindness, and it's why we're so pleased to have Nicki here today. We know that when the right supports and guidance are available, the early career phase of legal practice is super rewarding. And I truly believe that a career in the law is one of the best and most rewarding choices out there. So, at the Legal Services Board and Commissioner, we have a program of work that aims to provide guidance for early career lawyers and their supervisors. And a little later, I'm going to share with you some of our evidence-based resources that we've developed to support both parties to the supervision relationship. And before I pass on to Nicki, I want to let our audience know that we will have time to answer just 1 or 2 questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have something you'd like to ask Nicki, please pop it into the chat. And now, over to you, Nicki.
Thank you, Kerri-anne. Kia ora, everybody. So it is a real pleasure to be with you here today. We've got quite a lot that I want to cover with you in this session. So for the next 40 to 45 minutes, buckle in. We're in for a bit of a quick ride. I'm not a lawyer, But I have had many experiences of supervision and supervisory relationships. I have been a supervisor, I've been a supervisee, sometimes at the same time in different roles. So though I'm not a lawyer, I hope that I can share some of my experiences with you, and also some of what the evidence is telling us about how important this stuff is. So thank you for the opportunity to dig in around this stuff with you. So we do have a lot to cover. I'm going to share a little story about supervision from my context. We're going to look at what kindness is, how it's different from niceness, why it matters in a legal setting, and how we can start to look at it as infrastructure. We're then going to look at supervision in particular. So there is an asymmetry of relationship there. We're going to dig in a little bit around that. We're going to look at some of the VLS. Oh gosh, see, this is the Kiwi in me. I'm going to struggle with this. The B and C. I'm just going to call you guys the regulator from this point forward. Apologies, everybody. The Victorian regulator has done some amazing work in the area of supervision. So we're going to have a look at some of those stats and how it applies to you guys. We're then going to look at some of the different conversations we need to have inside supervisory relationships. We need to have different structures of conversations for different types of situations. We're going to spend some time looking at that. And really importantly, we're going to finish on the what now. What are some of the practical skills that you can take away and put into practice regardless of your position inside that supervisory relationship? So let's get going. So as I said, I wanted to start by sharing a story of what supervision has been for me. I have lots of good examples of being a supervisee. I've got some great examples of being a supervisor, but I've also got some terrible examples. My first attempts at supervision were probably appalling by anybody's standards. The story I want to share with you, however, is one that happened to me a couple of years ago in my first year of the PhD. So I want to start with this a conversation that didn't happen at the right time. And I want to talk about what that silence cost me. So supervision is meant to be a safeguard for us. It's meant to hold us steady while we learn the ropes of a new profession or a new role. When it works really well, we barely notice it. But when it doesn't, it can produce a particular kind of damage that can be hard to get over, because the person that's meant to be keeping you safe is the one that's making you feel unsafe. So that's the sort of relationship I want to talk about today. So my first year as a PhD at medical school, I experienced an example of terrible supervision to the point where I almost abandoned this PhD, not because I didn't believe in the work, but because I didn't know if I had the resilience to keep going with it. My supervisor at the time, I chose because of his publication record in Human Connection. He seemed like a really good fit on paper. The supervision relationship quickly went south, so it started as ordinary rudeness. It's the sort of rudeness where you're not even quite sure if it's rudeness or what feels off about it. So for me, it started with comments about that I would do well to remember how lucky I was that he had agreed to be my supervisor. It was a lot of telling me what to do rather than helping me reflect on what we could do. It kind of sharpened, so I tried to ignore those little red flags that started popping up, and over time it escalated. So I remember this really famous researcher contacted me out of the blue. He'd heard about my PhD and wanted to meet. So I said to my supervisor, wow, this guy wants to meet me. I was starstruck. The supervisor forbade that meeting. So he said that, he questioned why someone like that would want to meet with someone like me. So I think it was like the biggest red flag at the time, but I still thought, I just need to fly under the radar, keep it quiet, I can get through this. These were the red flags. I was junior. I hadn't come to academia in the usual way. I guess part of me wondered if he was right. I think I had a good dose of imposter syndrome, which I'm sure many of you, many of our juniors are experiencing. And this is the part that I want you to sit with. I'm not telling you this story for any sort of pity or sympathy. It's the whole reason why we're here today. That silence, that was costly. It wasn't a neutral silence. It didn't make the problem go away. It allowed the problem to sit. It allowed the problem to spread. As I said, the behaviour started to escalate. Before I knew it, I was in over my head, out of my depth. Because I'd been silent, there were no signals to him that anything he was doing was out of the ordinary, that anything he was doing was unacceptable. So I decided, there came a point he'd threatened to withdraw as my supervisor unless I fell back into line. I decided that that was my opportunity. I emailed him back and I said, "You're right. I think this relationship has become untenable. I'll let the university know." Well, once I went down the process of laying a formal complaint, I found out that I wasn't the first PhD student this had happened to. There were several before me that had abandoned their PhDs rather than face the difficult process of laying a complaint. We don't need to go into the specifics of how it was dealt with, except to say that I didn't change the world by making a complaint. It was a very brave thing to do, but nothing necessarily changed for the better. I was kicked outside the process. I learned third hand the consequences, which were very, very small for him and very big for me. Now, the point I want to land on here is that my silence isn't the reason this relationship went wrong. The system that allowed this sort of relationship to develop unchecked, that's the problem. We are the system, and we can all take steps to improve the system that we're in. That's what we're going to look at today, what we can do within our own locus of control to start building better, safer supervisory relationships. On that note, let's dig in. So this was a PhD looking at what kindness is. The very first roadblock, other than finding out for myself why kindness matters so much, is this. We don't have a good definition of kindness in our literature. In mainstream media, we have this really polarised view of kindness. So for some, kindness feels like a very weaponised term, especially I find with some of our senior lawyers, they're almost allergic to the word kindness because for them it's come to represent a tool for coercion, for control, a way of keeping people silent, a way of stopping people from showing dissent or dissatisfaction. That's not what we're talking about today. And on the flip, if you're here for a puppy dogs and kittens and rainbows presentation, you're in the wrong place. We're not talking about toxic positivity. So we're not talking about these sorts of messages that we see popping up on Facebook, on Insta. Just be kind. Nothing else matters. Be kind whenever possible. It's always possible. It's not. Okay, it's harder for some than others to be kind. We're going to look at that in the context of supervision. So let us keep exploring then. What is kindness? The super geeky version of this is that I analysed like 1,600 studies looking at what kindness is in the context of healthcare to find that there was no definition. I came up with a very academic definition. I'm not going to share it here, but this is the version that we put out there in the Harvard Business Review, a nice, accessible kind of version of kindness. So kindness is the proactive effort to support somebody else's growth, well-being, or success. It's a set of observable and intentional actions. In an organisation, kindness manifests itself in systems and structures that allow people to live their own values and to work well together. Really importantly, and something that we didn't find in the literature at all because it's not really an academic concept, kindness versus niceness. This is, if you take one thing away from the session today, I want you to really think about this. So when we talk about kindness in organisations, we're not talking about agreeability. We're not talking about niceness. We're not talking about comfortable silence. We're talking about something that looks in practice a lot like what you probably are already doing but don't have a name for. Kindness means giving feedback that you don't want to give because somebody needs it to grow and develop. It means naming a problem that other people might prefer that you don't name because the work needs it. It means holding a standard, even when holding that standard makes you unpopular within your team. So niceness is the opposite of all of that. Niceness is about keeping the status quo, like not ruffling any feathers, not hurting anybody's feelings. It's certainly not about engaging in difficult conversations or sitting with discomfort. Kindness, what I want you to understand, kindness is not always an easy thing. Actually, sometimes kindness feels like one of the hardest things in the world. But we have tools that we can share, and we'll share today, to help make this feel a little bit easier for you. We tend to confuse kindness and niceness because sometimes they can look quite similar. Sometimes it is about being quiet or being polite or smiling at the right moment with the right people, but there is that fundamental difference underneath. Another thing I want you to take away today, kindness is not a mood, it's not a personality trait. Kindness is a professional discipline, it's a skill, and because of that we can treat it like any other professional discipline. It can be taught, it can be measured, and it can be expected inside your relationships at work. As I said before, it shows up across organisational functions, including how supervision is designed, supported and executed. What we don't want is a situation where it's left to the individual to carry that weight and work alone. So what does this look like? What does the evidence tell us about how it's working in the Victorian legal world right now? So the VLSB+C surveyed Victorian lawyers and supervised legal practice only a couple of years ago. So they started with the supervisees and then followed up with the supervisors. This is incredible work. It's not often that we get to have a look at the matched view of what it's like from two different perspectives, two different roles in the same relationship. Read together, there were some really interesting stats that jumped out that I'd like to share with you here, where you see genuinely different things. So no one is being dishonest, they're speaking honestly, but because of their role or position, they're seeing it differently. For example, 78% of supervisors reported always or often asking about their supervisees' wellbeing. But 44% of supervisees said that their supervisors rarely or never ask. So those numbers don't quite stack up. And that's a curiosity that what I find interesting. And let's just put that back in context. So it's not just a Victorian law problem. And around the world, across workplaces, across professions, we're seeing the erosion of social connection and human connection in workplaces. So the Victorian Legal Services Research Centre has also reported that uncivil professional behaviour is rampant. This is also mirrored in international research such as Christine Porras' work in the same area. It's not a Victorian problem. It's not a legal only problem. It's what happens when we don't ask our systems to carry the relational work deliberately. So for the rest of our time together, let's explore what that might look like. It can be through the language that we choose to use. It can be through the boundaries that we set or we don't. The expectations that we name, including what we want our supervisory relationship to look like from both sides. And it can be through our patterns of communication that we default to. And before we go on, let's just be really honest about this work. I mentioned I'm not into the puppy dogs and kittens approach to kindness. So let's just acknowledge that there are huge challenges facing our legal profession at the moment. And within the supervisory relationship, that it's no different. So supervisors, I read somewhere, yet 60% of supervisors that were surveyed for this Victorian study, 60% said that the supervisors are working longer hours because of these supervisory responsibilities. Almost half have had no formal training in how to be a good supervisor. 1 in 3 don't feel that they're given enough time to carry out these duties. These are not unkind people. They're working in conditions that make good supervision very hard. Now, on the flip, when we look at our supervisees, it's different, but it's not easier. 42% wanted a better understanding of what supervision should even be. As a junior, you only know what you know and you don't know what you don't know. So they're not clear on what good supervision should even look like. 28% wished that they felt more comfortable asking their supervisor for support. On top of that, they're battling with anxiety and imposter syndrome. So both sides have constraints. No one is failing, and both are working harder than they need to inside our current system. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. I have a boy at home who loves Star Wars. Apologies for this graphic if you're not a Star Wars fan. So again, on a serious note, the Supervisee survey 2023 showed that almost 4 in 10 supervisees had experienced bullying in some way, shape or form, or at least challenging behaviours from their supervisors. So maybe not bullying, but actually, being talked down to, supervisors using power as control, humiliating language or phrasing, shouting and swearing. Now, unfortunately, we know that in most settings, not just in law, it's actually the supervisees that carry most of that weight of how to fix or heal that relationship. So that's on top of, if we, as a supervisee, we might talk to a safe person and be like, this doesn't feel quite right. Like I feel, he's being really rude, or what did he mean by this comment? Do you think that's okay? And we get told you need to learn to suck it up. You've got to be more resilient. If you want to succeed in law, you've got to get a thicker skin. Some of this might be true, but it's sending a pretty damaging signal to our juniors in the relationship. It's not putting a lot of weight on the supervisor stepping up to fulfill their obligation there to create safe conditions. With that in mind, let us think about some of the common conversations that we see in supervision. Now, most supervision conversations that I've seen have failed not because the supervisor is unkind, but because the supervisor is having the wrong kind of conversation for what the situation actually needs. On the flip, the supervisee is then receiving the wrong kind of conversation and not knowing what kind they are in is actually a source of distress in itself. So there's 3 most common situations that need 3 different types of conversations. A supervisee who is genuinely learning needs one thing. A supervisee whose work is slipping in patterned ways, they need something different. And then a supervisee whose behaviour is harming clients or colleagues needs something different again. We're going to spend a little bit of time exploring this now. This is a huge part of my work, so I work across professions in this area. I watch senior practitioners time and time again walk into situations where they have a default conversation that they go to for every situation. Some of this is not taking the time to engage in reflective practice before they step into a conversation that they know is going to be difficult. But actually, sadly, some of this is because there's a real lack of training out there on how to do this better. So we do the best with what we have. So let's take a look. Type 1, the coaching conversation. The purpose of these sorts of conversations in a supervisory relationship has to do with growth and development. So your supervisee is not doing anything wrong at all. It's just that there's something that you know or some knowledge that you can share that could help them grow and develop and step up to the next level. Taking the time to help them get there is an investment as a supervisor that you can make in helping lift them up and see them grow and develop. With these sorts of conversations, a coaching conversation is more about asking questions than about telling someone how to do something. So you're holding a curiosity about what that supervisee genuinely perceives inside their interactions, inside their written work. Sorry, I need my glasses on. Naming where they could extend their thinking or practice in ways that could see them go to that next level. So let's take a look at an example here. A supervisee has drafted a really competent letter of advice, but they're missing an opportunity to frame the risk to the client more clearly. What should the supervisor say or ask? So there's nothing wrong with the work. It's just that it could be better. Sometimes us supervisors tend to default, because we might be short on time, to telling someone what they should do differently. It's not the best approach forward. So not, this is wrong, fix it, but why not try, walk me through this. Tell me how you thought about the risk here. What was the client most concerned about? Where did that show up in the letter? Or how could you insert a phrase into the letter that could better highlight that risk? So you're walking alongside your supervisee, you're helping them to develop the reflective practice skills that they need to succeed. Then we have type 2, the feedback conversation. The purpose of this is for correction. So there is a gap between where that supervisee's skill level is at, or their behaviour, and where they need to be. So they might be falling behind in a certain area. These conversations are still developmental, but they need to be more directive. They need to be specific and observable. They need to come with examples of recent work. Sometimes in the coaching world, we call this SBIA, this type of feedback. So situation, behaviour, impact, and action. That's how you can structure it to make sure that that conversation lands in the right place, where everyone understands what the issue is and what action's required going forward. Sometimes this can go wrong. In this situation, sometimes we still default to the coaching situation, the conversation that feels safe, feels nice. We try and take the edges of the feedback off so that it sits better with the supervisee, but as a result, the advice doesn't land and they can't develop. So again, let's take a look at an example here. So a supervisee consistently submitting incomplete work, right on deadline or late. Perhaps this is, a piece of work that requires an executive summary, but consistently they're missing out that executive summary. As a supervisor, it means that you've, on top of an already busy workload, you're then staying back after work to type out that executive summary to get it sent off by deadline. So what should a supervisor say or ask in this situation? It's not a coaching conversation. It's not so tell me, how could you manage your time better? That's not the right approach we're using here. Here's what I would suggest trying, using that situation, behaviour, impact, action model. I need to give you some feedback on the last 3 memos. They've missed the executive summaries, which has meant that I then need to stay back and complete these before I can submit them on deadline. It might be we've talked about this before. In the future, I'm going to be adding an extra day to your internal deadline so that if that piece of work misses the executive summary again, I have time to send it back to you to fix ahead of our firm deadline. We'll keep doing this until you can get up to speed. In that situation, it's very clear what's being expected. So the supervisor's signalled that it's a conversation that's happened before and nothing's changed as they would expect. It's very specific. The supervisee knows exactly what they need to do differently to get up to speed. Now, a lot of the evidence out there would suggest that this is one of the hardest ones for supervisors. It's also when you're under pressure, it feels like extra time to have these sorts of conversations. And as a result, as a supervisor, you are staying back late at night, quietly fixing up the formatting or the content and sending it off without actually having that conversation. But if we don't have that conversation, that pattern's going to continue into the future. We want our supervisees, our juniors, to learn the skills and get themselves going and start to flourish. And then finally, this is a serious type of intervention. It's the hardest one to have. It's called the interventionist conversation. So in this situation, there's there's just harm being caused because of our supervisees' actions, their behaviour. It might be harm to other colleagues, outwards facing clients. In any case, this requires a conversation with immediate rectification of the changes. So you need to address a serious issue that requires direct naming, and you need to have a clear pathway of action. Again, you can use that framework that we just went through with the feedback conversation. Now, even in this case, even if it's serious, there are ways to do this where you retain respect for the other person. You don't need to humiliate them in public. You can make space for that conversation where they're not embarrassed, where they're not on the back foot. You shouldn't ambush someone with these types of conversations. So in a trusting and safe relationship, if you have to have this sort of conversation, you should be flagging it ahead of time. So, hey, in our meeting tomorrow, we have this particular issue to discuss. I need you to come prepared. So let's have a look at a real example here. So a supervisee has been dishonest about a missed deadline. They're telling a client that a document had been sent when it had not, or sent without approval. What should be said? So this is not the time for a coaching conversation. It's not the time to sand those rough edges off. You actually need this to land in a very specific way. So it's not a try not to let that happen again, or I can't believe that you don't know how to do this. That's not going to help. It's going to shut down the conversation before it's got a chance of having any kind of impact. Let's think about how we could do this differently. So as I said, you would not ambush them. You start the meeting, you're not asking questions, you're telling at this point. So I need to speak to you about the Smith file. That client was told that the document had been sent when it hadn't. That's a serious issue, and we need to talk about this properly so it doesn't happen again. You're not asking them to explain yet. You're not giving them the opportunity. You're naming what has happened and what needs to happen going forwards. So then you need to explain the impact. So telling a client something untrue, it affects them, it affects our practice, it affects my ability to trust your communications going forward. I need you to take that in before we go any further. Now, if it's a serious event and it's going to need some formal process around it, you might say, we're correcting the client communication today together. I need some time to consider whether this requires further escalation, and I'm going to let you know shortly. And going forward, I need you to come to me the moment that something goes wrong, not after. So you need to be really specific. Okay, now bring it all together because I've just chucked a whole lot of information at you. There's a lot that you're going to need to take away and process, I'm sure. One thing I do want to really emphasize is that these 3 conversations, they're not a checklist. You can't use them as sort of a set concrete process to follow. Most supervision is a real mixture of those different types of conversations, and conversations can shift partway in. So coaching conversation can become a feedback conversation if something that is mentioned in that conversation reveals a deeper issue. A feedback conversation can become interventionist if something that the supervisee does or says in their response shows a refusal to engage or a real lack of understanding about what exactly has happened and why they need to change. So the diagnostic move here, it isn't asking you to pick one and stick to it. I'd encourage you to reflect before you go into these conversations, to think about what type of conversation is required, and also to notice if you think it needs to change and change tacks. So when that happens, it's fine to stop stop the conversation and say, I think actually we need a different conversation than the one that we started with. Can we just step back a moment? Reframe. It's not a weakness, it's a supervisor doing the most important thing that they can do, which is naming out loud what's actually happening. Now we're going to move to the final sections here. The most important bit, the what now. This section is split into supervisor and supervisee, but stay with us because I think it's actually really useful to think about this together despite the differing roles in the relationship. Okay, so the doing, the practical actions for supervisors. Most of the work that makes a difficult conversation successful happens before we even step into that conversation. If you walk into a conversation cold or sandwiched between two billable matters with no clear sense of what you want to say, the conversation will reflect that. It can go off track, it can feel rushed or unstructured. You'll be dissatisfied and your supervisee will probably leave it feeling quite confused. It's not a big fix, it only takes about 30 seconds or so just to prepare by yourself. So number one, what kind of conversation is this? What we've just talked about. Name it ahead of time. 2, think about perhaps 2 or 3 things that really need to get said in that conversation to give yourself some focus about what needs to be said or discussed. 3rd, think about the settings. As we talked about, if it's a quick check-in, if it's a, yay buddy, you're doing great, that may be fine to have in the corridor. If it's an interventionist conversation where there's serious issues involved, set that up properly so that your supervisor's dignity and their respect is intact and it's done with the least amount of anxiety that is possible. And then, as I said, 4th, don't ambush. So give the supervisee a heads up about what's on the table for discussion. No one can go into a conversation open-heartedly and with an open mind if they feel that they're already on the back foot. Now, another note here, we've spent this session focusing on conversations, but actually a supervisory relationship is built in those small everyday moments. It's not always a conversation. Trust and support and respect is built in the everyday. So let's have a think about how we can do that. This stuff really matters because if you haven't built this sort of relationship that's happening and showing up in small everyday moments, when a crisis or a difficult patch hits, you haven't got the trust and the connection to fall back on to make that conversation safe. So what does good supervision look like when nothing's going wrong? There's a couple of things, and some of them are reflected in the survey done by the regulator. So be findable, be accessible. The supervisee survey told us that 3 out of 10 supervisees wish that they felt more comfortable asking for support. You don't need to be constantly available. It's actually really important to keep good boundaries in a professional relationship, but you do need to be someone that the supervisee can consistently reach and trust. You can handle the small mistakes well, and you can do that with consistency. This teaches your supervisees what will likely happen with a big one. What's worse than making a mistake is being scared to admit when there is one that needs fixing and you can't fix it yourself. Now, 1/3 of our supervisees reported that they were not having regular supervision sessions with their supervisors. If there aren't protected regular meetings, that's not structured supervision, that doesn't count. These meetings, even when there's nothing big on the table to discuss, they allow for the conversations that make the difficult ones easier to have. Try not to let them drift, even if you're busy. And then finally, say what you notice. Don't just be on the lookout for the bad stuff. Try and notice the good and send little signals of appreciation and gratitude when your supervisee is really smashing it. It's amazing how much more that can do to confidence and showing initiative than being constantly told what you're getting done, what you're doing wrong. Now, supervisees. There's also stuff you can be doing. This section is noticeably shorter, because it's, as we talked about, there's an asymmetry there. It's not on you to build this relationship from the ground up. There are things, though, that are reasonable to expect supervisees to know how to do. Number one, receive the conversation well. Think about what type your supervisor is trying to have with you. Is it a coaching one? If it is, do some thinking out loud. Be prepared to show your reasoning. Be open to learning new perspectives and admitting what you're still not sure about. We don't need the right answers, we need the honest answers. In feedback conversations, your supervisor is trying to tell you that there's something that you could do specifically to improve your practice. It usually comes from a place of believing in you and knowing that if you just tweak a couple of small things, you can do even better. Go into these discussions with that in mind. Keep an open heart about this stuff. Listen. Ask for specific examples if you're still not clear. You can disagree with the feedback by all means, but do it thoughtfully and recognise that your intent may not be how it's landing to the outside. And if it is an interventionist conversation, this is serious. Treat it seriously. If you're not sure what is being asked of you, clarify. Ask what support is in place to help you, and this is something Kerri-anne's going to touch on in a couple of minutes. If you need time to absorb the weight of the conversation that you're in with these serious issues, do that. Ask for some time. Ask for, is there a way I can come back to you in a day or so once I've processed? That's fine. It's a responsible way to do things. It shows you're trying to be reflective. Again, you don't have to agree with everything that gets said, but you do need to actively seek to understand what has happened and why it can't happen again. It's also not your job to guess what type of conversation this is. If you're unsure, ask. Can I just check? Is this about trying new things? Or is there something that I'm doing that I need to do differently? That's fine. Name what you need. So that supervisee survey from 2023 tells us that 42% of you want a better understanding of what good supervision should be. 3 out of 10 wish that they felt more comfortable asking for support. The lesson here isn't that you need to become better at advocacy necessarily. It means that you need to understand that there are things that you can reasonably ask for, and that the more concrete you can be in asking for them, the more likely you are that your supervisor will understand and be able to provide the support that you need. So here's some examples. Clear expectations for work. If you're struggling, ask, can you show me an example of what good looks like for these types of memos, for example? Better structured time. If you're consistently missing that regular supervisory meeting, it keeps getting rescheduled or postponed or delayed, ask. Our supervised meetings, they don't seem to have been easy to protect for you lately. Is there a different time or format that might work going forwards? Specific feedback. You've tried a new piece of work. I'd find it helpful if you could tell me what you thought of how I handled the Smith file, particularly the advice section. That's something I found really tricky. I'd love to know if I was on track. And one that addresses something that we talked about earlier, confirming that we've understood. So before we wrap up, can I just check my understanding, what you're asking me to do differently? None of these are about managing your supervisor. They're about being clear on your own behalf about what you need to do your job well. Now, this is one of the most important parts of this session. As I alluded to in my own supervision story, and many of us have them, I'd like you to understand when something has crossed the line and what you can do about it. Now, in 4 of 10 of our supervisees are telling us that they've experienced damaging behaviour in their supervisory relationship. We need to think about that. That's not incivility, that's harm. And 3 things I want you to take from this. I want you to recognise the difference between hard feedback, which can feel very uncomfortable when you're receiving it, and the difference between that and unprofessional behaviour. Shouting, swearing, gaslighting, humiliation, that's not normal. That's not acceptable behaviour. If you're receiving any of these, you're not receiving feedback that's going to help you grow, and it's something that you probably want to check with a safe space to understand what's going on. Secondly, trust your own perception. Don't stay silent like I did and think that the problem's going to just go away. It doesn't. It sets and it spreads. If something feels wrong to you, it's probably not that you're being oversensitive. If it feels seriously wrong, it's probably because something is in fact wrong. You don't need to be certain before you act, by the way. You only need to take that instinct seriously. And third, know the pathways. The VLSB+C, the Law Institute, Employee Assistance Programs, all of these exist as routes outside of your supervisory relationship. And here's the thing, all of them exist because there's a need for them. 4 out of 10 of you have experienced damaging behaviours inside your supervisory relationships. It means 4 out of 10 of us who have come out the other side and are supervisors now, we've probably also experienced some of those experiences that you're having now. You're not alone. And most of us do know how difficult the experience that you're having is, and we're here to help. The profession's genuinely changing. I think what we're willing to accept as conditions of professional life, of these rites of passage that we have to suffer through, I think that's shifting, and I think that shift is right. Right, to finish off, so what I want you to take from today is to understand that the supervisory relationship is not about a transfer of knowledge from supervisor to supervisee. It's not a series of meetings to be scheduled and then signed off or ticked in the box. This is about how to build a better relationship between two people inside conditions that either support it or undermine it. Why we need to care about this, just to finish off, the reason that this matters beyond your immediate supervisory relationship is because this is where the profession is made. The lawyers who are supervisees today are our supervisors of tomorrow. The relational conditions that they experience are the ones that they will take forward, or with any luck, in some of our situations, with deliberate work, they can change. If we want a legal profession that treats junior lawyers well, that retains their promising young talent, that produces lawyers who can have honest conversations with colleagues as well as with clients and with themselves, supervision is one of the most important places to do the work. And with that, I'm going to hand back over to Kerri-anne Millard, who's going to walk us through some of the resources that the VLSB+C has developed specifically to support supervisors and supervisees in this work. The resources that she's going to cover give you a structural scaffolding for supervision. What I've been talking about is some of the relational layer that makes that scaffolding function. Both layers matter, so let's welcome Kerri-anne back.
Thank you, Nicki. I think that today has been really quite a treat because you've managed to talk about systems thinking and how we do this within the system, but also provide really practical examples of what both parties to the relationship can bring. And actually, we do have some questions, and I think the questions actually reflect the practical tips that you've put forward. So the first one is, what do you do when you've requested regular feedback sessions with your supervisor? So this is coming from someone under supervision, and they agree, but then they cancel them.
So it's really important. I mean, you are within your rights. Often we don't feel it as juniors. And again, if we're already battling with imposter syndrome and anxiety, or we think we're not quite good enough, we forget there are really specific ways that we can ask for support. And I think, to use Brene Brown's saying, clear is kind, have you tried to ask the supervisor specifically around if there's a better format that you could use? Showing some understanding. So, we've looked at the challenges on both sides. Supervisors are trying to fit this in on top of their already busy practice. They're often not allowed extra time for it. They're under a lot of pressure. You don't want to add to that, but actually one of their responsibilities is to be a good supervisor. So if they can't fulfill those obligations within the context of their other work, maybe there's someone that can. So maybe it's a case of going, hey, look, I recognize this isn't working. Maybe you just don't vibe with your supervisor also, and that's why the meetings seem to keep getting cancelled.
Yeah.
Is there someone better that could support me or support us? Is there a 2IC that could also help with some of these meetings? There's often solutions. It's about being brave enough to ask, but also being really specific with what you need. And that's okay. You don't need to feel ashamed about coming forward with that stuff. Yeah.
So a bit of curiosity.
Yeah, and willingness to show initiative. Yeah.
And then, pardon me, we had a couple of questions that I think are a little bit similar, on a similar vein, and they're both really asking around how to deal, again, from an early career lawyer perspective, how to deal with the discomfort of practicing kindness, not niceness, as a new or early career lawyer. And then I think that discomfort around being concerned that it might be taken the wrong way, or someone might complain about them and they're at the start of their career, or their supervisor may not take it in the vein it's intended.
Yeah. This is a really good question. In other professions that have access to really good supervisory education, one of the things that gets done right at the start, and I think in healthcare and law we could do this a lot better, you set up an agreement at the start. Now I think that happens a lot in law firms now, so there's an agreement that's kind of put in place. We're going to have meetings every 2 weeks. This is the sort of structure. But there's another part of that around the relational stuff that we could add to those supervisory agreements. So actually being upfront when you're entering into the relationship, going, these are my preferences, this is my style. And again, for our supervisors to be like, sometimes we're going to have hard conversations. You can trust that if we're having those conversations, it's because I believe that you can be better with a little bit of extra support. Likewise, as a supervisee, my personal style, I like to be direct, I like to be honest. Please tell me if anything I say isn't landing the right way. If you have any issues with how we're working together or the way that I'm interacting with others, please let me know. We know with this kindness stuff that intent doesn't always reflect what we think the impact is going to be. So being open to dialogue about that is really important, and having those conversations, stepping into these roles, going, there's things I'm going to say to you, or I'm a direct kind of person, please don't be offended, or if I upset you in any way, come back and tell me. Open up that space where it's okay to talk about this stuff.
I think that's actually an excellent segue into the next part here. And so I'd like to thank you, Nicki, very much. And also thank you to everyone who's submitted questions. As I said, that's a good segue, because before we finish today, I really did want to take a moment to share with everyone the set of resources that our team here at the VLSB+C has recently released. They are on the screen now for you to see them. The Early Career Lawyer Capability Framework, the Supervision Template and the Reflective Practice Template, as well as drawing on research that we conducted that Nicki was speaking about before on the experiences of supervisees and supervisors. The team has consulted widely with legal education experts to create these resources. And firstly, I'll just talk to the Early Career Lawyer Capability Framework. It's designed to guide supervisors and supervisees on the capabilities and skills that we expect lawyers to develop during supervised legal practice. The framework outlines the capabilities supervisees need to develop for independent legal practice. And also they guide supervisors to think about the type of work for lawyers that they need to have to supervise and then identify the development opportunities, really to build those capabilities. The 5 capability domains in the resource are ethics and professional responsibility, legal knowledge and application, interpersonal and communication skills, professional skills, and professional development and wellbeing. And we've set these capabilities against performance indicators, so supervisors and supervisees can discuss how to achieve each capability and then measure if they're on track. So we really encourage you to give this practical evidence-based framework a go. Next, I'm going to talk to the supervision plan template, and it's designed to speak to the capability framework and help supervisors plan appropriate work across the 5 domains. Now, it's meant to be easy to complete, so hopefully it will be, and supervisors should complete it in consultation with their supervisee. So it really goes to what Nicki was talking about, to have dialogue right from the start and set up the relationship for success. It's actually a pretty simple idea, but nothing like it has existed before. So we think it might come in very handy for many of you. And finally, last but definitely not least, the reflective practice template. Now, reflective practice is a simple and time-efficient and evidence-based way to enhance professional performance and improve wellbeing. And it doesn't need to take a lot of time. And with this template, you can have a reflective practice that really should take you just 5 to 10 minutes a day. Nicki's spoken a bit about reflective practice, but the idea is that when you step back and actively reflect on your experience, you can maximise what you learn from those experiences. And that's because the act of purposeful reflection helps us to develop the skill of metacognition, or thinking about thinking. And so this in turn improves our ability to self-assess and promotes resilience and innovative thinking. And we see huge benefit in developing this skill at the outset of your career. Now, we all naturally reflect on our day-to-day experiences at work, of course, but reflective practice is a structured approach, and it helps you process what's happened and then improve your future performance. The more often you go through it, the easier and more instinctive it will become. Our template is based on Gibbs's reflective cycle, and it makes it really easy to embed this practice into your professional life. All 3 of the resources are available to download on your website, and they're also very easy to print off if you prefer hard copy to hold and fill in with a pen. Although I've got a dad joke in here that maybe that sounds strange to the younger lawyers tuning in, ho ho. Anyway, whatever way you prefer, please do use them and reap the benefits of the research, consultation and careful design that's gone into these resources to support early career lawyers to get off to the best possible start. Now, I think we're at the end of this webinar, Nicki. So why kindness matters for early career lawyers. And thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. A recording of this webinar is coming soon to our website, so look out for that. And in the meantime, please keep this conversation going and let us know how Nicki's tips and our resources are working for you. And please don't forget to connect with us on our socials. And at the moment, I'd just like to say goodbye from Nicki and from me.
Thank you. And thank you very much for having me.